Everybody. It is so wonderful to be back in this room after 3 long years. Welcome everybody to the spring 2022 science writing, thesis reading, the sequel. We had part 1 last night on Zoom. And tonight we're in person, and we are also being live streamed if technology is working. My name is Melissa Hendricks, and I am the Associate Director of the Science Writing Program. Joining me is Faculty Program Coordinator Sam Apple, who will be coming up to the lectern in a moment to introduce our readers. And I'll just say a few brief words beforehand. So absences help us recognize and savor the joy of community that we previously may have taken for granted. We may now even more appreciate the simple fact that people have this amazing ability to create new worlds with words, and even more fantastic, can come together to share these stories. This act of exchanging stories is both simple, I speak words, you hear them, and wondrous. My words can paint pictures in your mind or evoke feelings, thoughts, ideas that resonate with my own heart and mind. It's truly amazing. And now, thanks in no small part to the wonders of biomedical science and masks, we can once again gather to continue this marvelous tradition. Writers, thesis students, thank you for giving us this opportunity. And thank you for all you have invested in your writing. You make us incredibly proud. I would also like to thank a few other folks, key people without whom we would not have readings such as this. First, let's all applaud our wonderful faculty, some of whom may be joining us by Zoom. Faculty, an extraordinary group, and that group includes Sam Apple and Sue Eisenfeld, who've been the thesis instructors this semester. I would also like to thank the thesis advisors, those folks who've spent many hours as mentors to our thesis students. Thank you. And finally, a truly key group of people I'd like to thank are those of you who have stood behind these thesis students as they worked away at their craft. Thank you to spouses, partners, friends, children who have supported these writers as they endeavored at their thesis projects. And now I have the honor of introducing you to our host for the evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce program coordinator, author of the intriguing medical biography Ravenous, and recipient of last year's Excellence in Teaching Award, Sam Apple.
Welcome, everybody. It is incredibly nice to be here in person with all of you. This is my first in-person event at Johns Hopkins after being here for 2 years. And this is actually the first time I in-person met Melissa. I just made up that term, in-person met. But it's really special for me to be here with all of you and to be here these wonderful students that many of whom I've had the pleasure of working with directly and some indirectly as program coordinator. Melissa thanked a lot of people, but I want to use this opportunity to thank Melissa for all she does for the program. In the past 2 years, I've learned a lot from Melissa about logistics of the program itself, but I think even more than that, I sort of had a front row seat to true professionalism and true dedication to one's career, and it's super impressive. So I think she deserves an applause. As a steal of the moment. So when I teach feature writing classes, I'll start with sort of the basic structure of a feature article, be it a science feature or another feature, and that is the lead or the introduction where you tell a little story, and then it's followed by the dreaded nut graph, which we talk about a lot, where you try to summarize sort of the main points of the piece and why you're writing about it. So I was thinking about that tonight as I was preparing these remarks and thinking about if this event itself were a feature article, how it would begin. And but you start a little story like on May 18th, 2022, 13 talented science writers met in a classroom at Johns Hopkins University to share their work. At the start of the event, the program's coordinator took a moment to kiss up to his boss. And so forth. And you try to bring people into the story, but then you'd have to get to this nut graph. And as I say in my classes, it's a horrible term because what is it? Nobody knows what nut graph means or why it's called a nut graph. And does anybody remember what I suggested as the replacement for that? I suggested that we change to the why it matters paragraph, because that's really what it's trying to do, and that makes sense. Sometimes it's more than one paragraph, but then maybe somebody sitting here pointed out that the acronym would then be WINT, which is not ideal, but we came to call it the WINT paragraph. So I was thinking that if I were writing about this event and I had to share the WINT, the why it matters paragraph, what would I write? And sometimes what I tell my students, if you're stuck on this, and it's really one of the keys to the piece, so you have to get it right, just say, just spell it out, why it matters, make a list of the things that matter. So I sat down and wrote up a little list, which I'll read here. I admit this would not be the most riveting lead for a published piece, but I hope it captures why this event matters so much to me and to the world, I think. It matters because the students reading this evening will be the next generation of science writers. It matters because science writing and the need to communicate science have never been more important. It matters because our students have all worked extraordinarily hard over the last months and years, many of them working full-time and still finding the energy and dedication to wake up early and stay up late to complete their coursework, somehow finding the strength to knock out one more sentence, to add one more comment to a Blackboard discussion. It matters because they have done this during a global pandemic that made it more difficult to do almost anything. It matters because the work they produce is of the highest caliber. It matters because they are not writing simply to entertain or to draw attention to themselves, but because they want, through their science writing, to communicate something true about the physical world and our place in it. It matters, in short, because they matter. It is my honor to share this stage with our wonderful students and to introduce our first reader, Haley Wasserman.
So many of you know. So this piece is a feature story that I wrote while I was doing an internship, and it's about model organisms and their importance in clinical discovery. So, it was a balmy day on Earth when animal life on land began. During the Cambrian period, around 440 million years ago, glaciers began to recede, warming the climate and creating new landscapes ripe for sea-dwelling organisms to explore. The creatures that led the charge onto land kicked off the evolutionary branch that would one day lead to incredibly complex and strange beings, humans. To survive in their new environments on land, species developed physical adaptations over many generations in a process called evolution. Fins became legs, scales became feathers, and biological diversification in the animal kingdom flourished. As the evolutionary tree grew exponentially, new categories of species and new branches on the evolutionary tree sprung up too. Yet despite the vast differences that emerged amongst these species, the genes and biological processes that ensure the survival of these creatures stayed fairly similar. Humans and their diseases are a product of these biological processes and histories that have persisted over millions and even billions of years, says Gabriel Becker, an evolutionary biologist at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He explains that the evolutionary tree provides biomedical researchers with a clear progression of biology over swaths of time, in turn helping them make scientific predictions about human physiology and diseases. Using monoorganisms such as flies, worms, and amoebas to understand the mechanics and functions of biological processes is very common in biomedical research. Deep in the minuscule genomes and cells of amoebas, one researcher hunts for answers about cellular structures and their influence on human disease. In a small petri dish, a tiny single-cell creature plods onward, lurching forward to a dinner of bacteria. As its slow hunt continues, this organism's cellular boundaries shapeshift, holding the inner contents of the cell steady and creating leg-like projections helping the organism move. This is Dictyostelium discoideum, a soil-dwelling amoeba helping researchers like Doug Robinson uncover insights into the organization and structure of human cells, as well as how cancer cells can metastasize and move throughout the body. He favors amoebas because of their close evolutionary ties to humans. Humans share 1/3 of their genes with amoebas, and these genes, known as conserved genes, encode for proteins and cellular structures that are similar between the two organisms, allowing them to survive for generations. I've often joked to anyone that asks that humans are really just amoebas with hair, Robinson says. Even though their evolution looks different than ours, amoebas are highly useful to study, especially in the topics that I study. Robinson's main research centers on the cell's abilities to change their shapes during biological events. Occurrences like cell division or changes in a cell's environment require a cell to alter its structure. His lab studies a network of proteins within cells that provide structure, shape, and stability, known as cytoskeletons. Robinson likens these networks to protein tubules that are found in both amoebas and humans and relates them to the frame of a house. Cytoskeleton structure is adaptable and often changes based on what's going around a cell. Different arrangements of the cytoskeleton can give a cell certain advantages or disadvantages, and in the case of the amoeba, a rearrangement of its cytoskeleton allows it to move dynamically. The success or failure of Robinson's experiments offer hints about whether his interpretations of amoeba's cytoskeleton processes are accurate. Robinson says using these simulations in tandem with genetic manipulation experiments help him determine if there are similarities in human cancer cells. By confirming what kind of changes happen in an amoeba's cytoskeleton, Robinson knows exactly what changes to look for in a cancer cell. And now I'm pleased to introduce our next reader, my classmate Jane Williamson-Lee.
Thank you, Haley. I will be reading an excerpt from my piece called "Diabetes Patients Do-It-Yourself Solutions Are Still the Standard of Care." For 33 years, Orla Wilson managed her type 1 diabetes well. "I always had reasonable control," she says. "I didn't really think too much about it." But when her 7-year-old daughter, Polly, received the same diagnosis in 2014, she and her husband began losing sleep. They were waking up every 3 hours in the night to check Polly's continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, ensuring her blood sugar didn't drop dangerously low in her sleep. Wilson, an associate teaching professor of engineering at Johns Hopkins University, decided to search online diabetes forums for advice and support. That's when she learned she could program a machine to take the night shift. For Wilson and her daughter, living with type 1 diabetes requires around-the-clock maintenance. Since their bodies don't produce any insulin, the hormone that fuels cells in the bloodstream with glucose, they need to inject it. Without the right amounts of insulin, glucose builds up in a diabetic's bloodstream, unable to be absorbed by cells that need it to function, and their blood sugar can rise. Insulin is like the key that opens up the door or membrane of the cell. Without that key, you can't get the energy inside the cells, effectively starving them. says Dr. Michael Haller, a pediatric endocrinologist at the University of Florida Health. Wilson had stumbled on an online manual with step-by-step instructions to build a device that could administer her and her daughter's insulin automatically. The Open Artificial Pancreas System, or Open APS. The project, created by patient inventor Dana Lewis and software engineers Scott Lebrand and Ben West, was the first open source effort to create an artificial pancreas. Coming together in 2015, 2 years ahead of the first commercial system, Medtronic's MiniMed 670G. In early 2016, Wilson began building her own Open APS, joining a growing number of DIYers who elect to build their own artificial pancreas, either because the diabetes device industry does not offer what they need, or because what is offered is not affordable. Starting in May 2016, Wilson entered hundreds of lines of code into an open source software platform, following her Open APS instruction manual. Late in October that year, she got the device working in her Baltimore home office. On her computer screen, lines of information were stacking up as the system she built looped through her code. I just sat there watching my computer screen, she says, absolutely amazed by what it was doing. She had reverse engineered an old Medtronic insulin pump. Now it was hooked up to a small credit card sized computer called a Raspberry Pi, in which she programmed an algorithm to tell the pump how much insulin to give her automatically. The Raspberry Pi, or RIG, was downloading her blood glucose data every 5 minutes from her CGM, a patch she wears on her arm. If the data shows that her blood sugar levels are rising, the RIG tells the insulin pump to dispense more insulin to her subcutaneously. If her blood sugar levels are going down, the RIG tells the insulin pump to preemptively dispense less insulin. This communication between the devices is called a hybrid closed loop, or in action, looping. In order to keep their blood sugar levels at a safe level, Type 1 patients have to do traditional doctor-level thinking processes multiple times a day, Haller says, carefully weighing how everyday activities like eating, exercising, and sleeping will affect them. Wilson had been doing the mental calculations for insulin, and then manually entering into her insulin pump what adjustments to make to her insulin levels. Now there was a rig to do this for her. It's running in the background all the time, she says. I have to tell it when I eat, but it does everything else. After using the system safely for a few months, Wilson was able to convince her husband that it was safe enough for Polly to try one. Once they were comfortable with Polly using it, they could sleep easy knowing it was watching over her blood sugar. It probably didn't make a huge difference for me, Wilson reflects, but for our daughter, it made a very significant difference. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, my classmate, Lindsay Lee. Raised for Impact, a portfolio of PTSD.
Intrusion. I was searching for the Apple TV remote when it happened again. As I ransacked the pillows of my couch, unfocused on the Netflix thriller, a car horn roared through the soundbar speaker. Then the screech of tires on asphalt, followed by crunching metal. The unscathed actress panted in shock. I hardly heard her over my own gasps. My trembling fingers found the remote and hit pause. My heart beat so intensely, I feared it would burst from my chest. I gripped the couch cushions and took in the comforting surroundings of my cozy living room. I didn't dare look at the TV. You're at home, you're safe, deep breaths. The jolt of terror must have lasted seconds, but felt like hours. My limbs eventually released their clench and my breathing slowed. Finally, I could bear to glance at the screen. It's a movie, the crash wasn't real, no one is hurt. The hunt for the remote had done me in. If I'd been paying attention to the film, I'd have noticed the warning signs common to scripted auto accidents. A distracted driver, usually digging for a fallen smartphone, arguing passengers, poor visibility, bad weather, ominous music, that haunting camera angle through the car window that almost always precedes a T-bone crash. I've become hypersensitive to those clues in the last 3 years, always braced for impact. My therapist and I had been working to pinpoint which sensory input triggers me most. I'd been leaning towards sound. That day in October 2021 confirmed it, sending me back to June 2019. I didn't see the white Lexus SUV coming then either. Still shaken, I traced my fingers along the 2-inch scar at the base of my neck, just above my right clavicle. Collision. I was sitting behind Dad as we inched forward on Interstate 66 East in Vienna, Virginia, a few mile markers outside the beltway that encircles the nation's capital. Mom was driving us in her Toyota Highlander SUV. There's always traffic on I-66, but it seemed especially congested for noontime on a June Saturday. In an irony that came seconds later, I thought there must have been an accident ahead of us. I looked down at my phone, scrolling through my Audible library to pass the time. At 30, I'd already been on the receiving end of a handful of fender benders, all minor incidents with negligible injuries. The hit that came next eclipsed them all, a rear ending so intense that nearly 3 years later, I still feel it when I close my eyes at night. Within 15 minutes, I was in the back of an ambulance, about to be ferried to Inova Fairfax Hospital, where I volunteered as a teen. The ruined perpetrator stared me down through the ambulance windows, its buckled hood, obliterated headlight, and spilling engine innards forming a grimace. Infestation. It took nearly a year after the crash for me to consider that I might have post-traumatic stress disorder, and even longer to seek professional treatment. Surely I hadn't suffered enough to earn that diagnosis, I thought. That was a malady reserved for military veterans who'd endured the horrors of war and people who had survived a terrorist attack, natural disaster, sexual assault, or childhood abuse. None applied to me. More than 6.7 million motor vehicle traffic crashes occurred in the United States in 2019, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Of those, more than 33,200 were fatal. Mine wasn't, and for that, I'm grateful every day. My parents were each prescribed weeks of physical therapy to treat whiplash. My injuries, in innumerable ways invisible, were more severe, life-changing. And yet things could have been far worse. I should count my blessings. With each drop of self-pity, I felt a hint of shame. The pain was then part of my being. I became so immersed in my physical recovery that I didn't realize a mental illness was festering. The crash had ruptured 2 cervical discs in my neck between the C5, C6, and C7 vertebrae. The jelly-like ejected disc material was compressing the right side of my spinal cord, causing symptoms collectively called radiculopathy. Mine included numbness and tingling from my right shoulder down to the tip of my middle finger, along with nerve pain that physical therapy, a host of medications, and minimally invasive procedures, including a corticosteroid injection and radiofrequency ablations, a procedure that temporarily blocks a nerve's pain signals, couldn't fix. I also adjusted to a new job in a new state, Florida, and started my second master's degree as the COVID-19 pandemic took hold. I began counseling in 2020 to work through my generalized anxiety, which had flared up amid so much upheaval. Still, I didn't think much of the nightmares, the flashbacks, my refusal to sit in the right rear seat of any car in which I found myself a passenger, or the tears that dampened my cheeks whenever the headlights of a car behind me got too close. And now I'm pleased to introduce Kylie Wolf, who will be reading Rediscovering a Place Called Home.
I'll be reading a condensed version of my piece, Rediscovering a Place Called Home. Look for the farm pond with the island in the middle. I've heard my mom say the same words hundreds of times. It's her go-to when giving directions to our house. As familiar as the phrase is, I still smile when I hear it. And after a few weeks away, I'm comforted when the pond comes into view. In mid-March 2020, home feels a little gloomy. Spending a few weeks hiding out from the pandemic with my family adds another element of disruption to an already uncertain time. So I start taking daily walks to breathe deeper. Along with a few other discoveries, I witnessed the arrival of spring. Even though there isn't snow on the ground, everything is soft. The grass squishes and leftover leaves crunch beneath my feet. Other than a whiff of manure from nearby fields and the whirl of the wind, there isn't much activity. The fish haven't emerged from their nests yet, but the birds are starting to. They squawk at each other and the branches of the trees sway and creak. In the backyard, I find my favorite wildflowers, azure bluets, or Houstonia caerulea. They began to emerge in early May. A soft mustard-colored moss surrounds them. They grow in small clusters close to the ground and are only found in one area of the yard. Each stem meets a yellow center that fades into white, then purple on all 4 petals. As the days pass, I see new bundles appear. In June, we plant the biggest garden of my lifetime. It houses 48 tomato plants that provide much to process and preserve. A dozen zucchini plants are ready to give us countless meals, the rest spiralized or cubed and frozen for later. Each morning, I step into the dew, my open-toed shoes welcoming the cool moisture. Once I'm in the garden, I either sink in the freshly tilled soil or stand firm on its dry, cracked surface. I pluck 3 leaves of darkly colored kale to mix into my scrambled eggs, then proudly walk them back inside. Some days, fresh rain leaves our pond nearly overflowing, swallowing the island and making it barely visible. Other days, black and white cows meander through the field nearby. I see a robin or 2 hopping across the front yard, worm in mouth, and occasionally the sun peeks through, giving life to everything it touches. Lots of yellow daffodils bloom in every flower bed. Those, alongside a few gray hyacinths, made Easter a little brighter. Even in a time of darkness, nature shines. Bees, ladybugs, and butterflies buzz and land on the white blossoms of a tree just off the front porch. I enjoy visiting with them. The birds leave nests in bushes and trees too, because everything has a home here. As the pandemic progresses, I stay put. Soon, spring turns to summer and into fall, my favorite season. Parsley is still growing in the garden, so I spend hours picking, cleaning, and drying it. More than a dozen pints are ready to be used or gifted. The last of the tomato harvest sits on a table in the corner of the porch, waiting to ripen. Today, these red and green spheres, the size of baseballs, catch a few more rays, a chance they might not have tomorrow. As winter creeps in, frosted leaves now accompany some of my visits to the garden. White ice crystals line the petals of our marigolds. But one remnant of summer, a row of still standing kale, is now decorated with red bows. This holiday combination of hues leaves us with something other than snow to admire from our window. In January, Grandma cooks up an old-timey favorite, ham pot pie. She makes the broth herself, a recipe I'll try to mimic one day, then boils squares of homemade dough amongst sliced potatoes, onions, and chunks of ham. It's comforting and tastes like a hug. As spring changes to summer once again, we plant a garden much smaller than the last. This year, an abundance of rain limits its potential. Instead of a thriving green, everything is wilting and yellow. Suffocating from a lack of oxygenated soil, our precious kale leaves fall limp. The vines of the cucumber plants branch out, then shrivel. Last year's garden was watered mostly by hand. This year, it's been necessary only twice. After 15 months at home, I moved back to the city and away from the rural wonders of my childhood. There are so many people and places to miss, but the contrasting yields of our prized garden make me wonder if it misses me too. As I get older, I look forward to the days when my kids will visit this place. Will my favorite wildflowers still bloom in May in the same spot? Will my mom carry on the tradition of a garden? And will the land represent to my kids what it does to me? I picture them at age 3, maybe 4, throwing bread scraps into the pond as the fish swim over for a nibble. They'll run through the yard barefoot and rub their feet in the grass, tracking it into my childhood home, the new grandma's house. And maybe one of them will tuck a few of my favorite flowers in their pocket for me to find in the laundry that week. The pandemic was a source of tragedy and loss for many. In my life, it led to months of change and stress and uncertainty. In those moments, it's hard to find a silver lining, but I can't deny what it gave me. A chance to rediscover my love of home and family. When I need to reconnect with myself or just unplug, I know the best place to visit. because when the pond with the island in the middle comes into view, I'm home. Next, we'll hear from Kristen Hines.
Last spring, on the dusty frontier of a kitchen renovation, I struck gold. White gold, that is, asbestos. The ancient Greeks called asbestos the miracle mineral because it was both soft and seemingly indestructible. But today, asbestos is universally recognized as a toxic substance that kills tens of thousands of people every year after particles of the mineral embed themselves in victims' lungs, causing scarring called asbestosis, and even a deadly lung cancer, mesothelioma. Chrysotile asbestos, also called white asbestos, resembles cottony fibers that can be picked by hand from serpentine rock. For decades, Canada was the world's largest miner and exporter of chrysotile asbestos, and it was the last developed nation to acknowledge its harms, eventually banning the mineral's use in 2018. For most of the 20th century, Canadian manufacturers routinely added chrysotile asbestos fibers to paint, shingles, siding, and other materials to make them strong and non-flammable. In the 1970s, Canada subsidized the use of asbestos insulation, and many provinces offered their own incentives to builders installing asbestos-containing products. That's why some experts predict the rise in asbestos-related diseases hasn't peaked here, as it has in nations like France and the UK, both of which began banning asbestos decades before Canada did. Today, asbestos is the #1 cause of workplace-related death in Canada, and construction workers are the occupation group most at risk from asbestosis and mesothelioma. I first learned that asbestos lurked in my 1979 home's drywall through an email from Barb, the designer managing my kitchen renovation. Per Barb, asbestos is not a problem when not disturbed, so you haven't been in any danger living in the house, but it must be removed and disposed of with great care. If any asbestos dust gets into the air when the drywall is removed, it settles into the home, e.g. the carpets, fabrics, air ducts, and you can't get rid of it. Breathing in even a small amount can cause lung cancer. Just explaining this so you know how serious it is, although I expect you know this already. Barb's alarm defied the attitudes of 3 of my neighbors, whose homes are part of the same development as ours. Each proceeded with major renovations without anyone suggesting they test for asbestos in their homes. I later learned that a friend's home inspector had insisted to her that asbestos could be safely disposed of by a homeowner wearing the proper protective gear. But that's not what the government says. Health Canada recommends homeowners hire professionals to test for asbestos before doing any demolitions on homes built before 1990, the year the government estimates builders stopped installing these products. But testing costs hundreds of dollars. The process of procuring and processing 3 small samples of drywall from my kitchen cost nearly $800. No wonder homeowners might skip testing altogether, believing that a small amount is unlikely to harm them or their families. They might be right, but what about contractors who might be exposed to asbestos dust hundreds of times over a career? Of the 2 technicians our contractor, Kurt, had arranged to quote on our asbestos removal, George was the more outwardly enthusiastic about ridding our walls of the offending mineral in what is classified as a type 2, medium risk operation. As Kurt and I carefully explained which walls were to be removed, George started plotting a clean path out for the asbestos. He decided that his team would create a tunnel with plastic sheeting that would lead from the kitchen through the living room and out the front deck. A dumpster would be placed in the driveway to collect the pre-bagged pieces of drywall before they were carted off to a hazardous waste site. Our main floor would be sealed off by plastic sheeting with zipper closures. If we wanted to get from our upstairs bedroom to the kitchen on the main floor during the procedure, we'd need to don a mask and protective coveralls and pass through a clean room. The same process would apply if we wanted to move from the main floor to the basement foyer. George estimated the removal would take around 3 days. Then an extractor fan would have to run for at least 24 hours to remove any remaining particles from the air. George lost me at coveralls, so I decided my husband Sean and I would stay in the hotel for the duration of the work. The cost to remove asbestos from our 250 square foot kitchen was $7,368, not counting the cost of hotel stays and testing. The most practical solution to the high costs of asbestos might be as Canadian as asbestos itself: subsidies. This time to remove rather than install asbestos products. There's ample precedent for providing funding for home repairs. Canadians can access the one-time Canada Greener Homes grant to improve their home's energy efficiency. And in 2009, every Canadian could claim a tax credit for pretty much any home improvement they did that year. The government might also remove barriers to abatement by subsidizing the cost of testing or by developing less costly methods of collection and analysis. In recent years, some home builders associations and labor unions have called on the federal and provincial governments to follow the lead of countries like the Netherlands and implement a reimbursement scheme for asbestos testing and removal. However, no such funding was announced in this year's federal budget, and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation did not reply to requests for information on plans to offer reimbursement in the future. The Greener Homes grant is committed $2.6 billion over 7 years to help improve the energy efficiency of about 700,000 Canadian homes. That represents a lot less money than the $1.7 billion Canada spends annually to compensate workers who become sick from asbestos exposure. A similar grant for asbestos abatement would be a first step Canada could take towards undoing its toxic legacy of asbestos at home. But right now, homeowners have no incentive to do the right thing. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next writer, Frankie Katz.
I met Jeannie G in an Arizona hospital as COVID-19 first swept the state. She was standing between shelves of disinfectant and biohazard bags, recharging on a rare break. She'd spent her weekend in the orthopedic unit after 2 of their supervisors had tested positive for the virus. As usual, she was tasked with reassuring staff and patients that germs weren't hanging around. Jeannie always worked nonstop, but at the start of the pandemic, her work expanded from only operating in recovery rooms to offices, great rooms, hallways, and waiting rooms. As we made our way to the elevator, other staff members nodded warmly. Even though she'd worked at Honor Health's Shea Medical Center for almost 4 years, she still turned heads in the hallways. Jeannie certainly stands out. Patients and staff have always noticed her, but the pandemic illuminated the importance of her work. Jeannie has been programmed to think about infectious disease her entire life. She works under conditions harmful to anyone else. She is subjected to pressure and hours that would break other employees. But Jeannie G has bones of metal. See, Jeannie G is a germ zapping robot. She is a member of Honor Health's fleet of 38 disinfecting robots spread throughout the healthcare network. She and 9 other robots live on the job at Shea Medical Center. Xenex Disinfection Systems began developing robots like Jeannie G in 2008 to fight healthcare-associated infections, or HAIs. That year, an estimated 90,000 Americans died from infections they contracted in hospitals. Over 2 million Americans suffered from HAIs per year, costing US hospitals between $28 and $45 billion. These infections also cost people their trust in places and systems designed to keep them healthy and safe. Founded by 2 epidemiologists and Hopkins graduates, Xenex builds, sells, and services robots that use xenon pulsing UV light to eliminate airborne bacteria, spores, and viruses. The first Xenex robot prototypes joined hospital teams in 2010. By 2013, Xenex sold robots commercially, and by 2014, hospitals with robots on staff reported 50 to 100% reductions in their rates of HAIs. And in April 2020, Xenex robots were the first UV technology scientifically proven to kill the COVID-19 virus. Honor Health invested in Xenex robots in 2016. Its first metal team member was tasked with cleaning operating rooms before bone marrow transplants, procedures in which the risk of infection is exceptionally high. As more robots joined the staff, they were often spotted rolling through the hallways in the vicinity of an upcoming surgery. At Honor Health's Osborne Hospital, the 8 robot team members include Brittany, Frank the Tank, Sam Duke, and the Lemonator. Some robots are named by their donors. At $125,000 per robot, it's no surprise that the naming rights are part of the deal. Frank the Tank is named after a donor's late husband. Sadie and Tizzy are named after their donor's 2 standard poodles. Jeannie G was donated and named anonymously, but her nameplate is still bolted above the Xenex logo on her side. The Monday after she cleaned the orthopedic unit, I watched Jeannie G clean a demonstration room. Her human coworker rolled her between the bed and the door. He opened the bathroom door, pulled out all the drawers, and raised the bed's handrails so that she would have access to as much surface area as possible. He closed the curtain on the single square window so her light wouldn't harm anyone outside either. Then he logged into the tablet that serves as Jeannie G's brain. That brain communicates with Xenex, allows technicians to program the robots, and runs the disinfection cycles throughout the hospital. The demonstrator programmed the first of 3 4-minute cycles. A button on Jeannie's right side flashed green. Once we pushed the button, we left the room as quickly as possible, separating ourselves from Jeannie's harmful UV rays. For about 20 seconds, we listened as she rose to her full 5 feet 9 inches and exposed her UV bulb. If the tablet is her brain, then the pulsing xenon is her beating heart. And when Jeannie works, her heart is pumping for all our health. After Jeannie finished her first cycle, we were safe to re-enter the room and move her to the other side of the bed. As soon as the door opened, I was blasted with smell. No one had warned me about robot farts. I'm pleased to introduce our next reader, my classmate, Scott D. Crawford.
Wow, that is one really good Zoom background. It feels like I'm actually there. So I have a personal essay I'll be reading tonight, on the topic of addiction, alcoholism, and something I hope to do a lot more work in writing in the future. So it was, and it's called Broad Highway. It was a Saturday, the 16th of April in the year 2011, a day that would change my life. I sat parked in front of a regional treatment center for alcoholism. I was not there for myself though. I was not directly at least. I had just left a family session and a visit with my brother-in-law, Jeff. He had been a resident there at the center for the previous 3 weeks. I've never been so sure of my feelings at that point, but also never so scared. I was kind of frozen in thought. I'd always felt that my mind worked differently than others. I grew up gazing to the stars, thinking someday this alien spacecraft is going to come down, then they're going to call down to me and say, Scott, it's time to go home. We left you in the wrong spot. I replayed the past over and over and over again. I anticipated the future and I tried to predict what others would say and think. I lost track of what was real. I played out stories of what he would say, how I would respond, and what she would declare. The layers of my imagination. When I stepped into a room of people, I somehow understood what everybody thought of me. I picked out those who didn't like how I dressed. I understood those who thought I walked kind of funny. And I was aware when I interrupted conversations that were about me. I would always pursue some way to quiet that storm. When I was young, I found brown sugar. Sweet, compactable, chewy, raw brown sugar. Spoonfuls of it gave me chills when snuck before Saturday morning cartoons. The feeling that brown sugar gave me was always good, leaving me wanting more. I found the critics upstairs silence themselves with each scoop. And by the 7th grade, I found alcohol. My drink of choice was stolen booze from my parents' liquor cabinet, all mixed up together to hide this disappearance from any single bottle. While the burning was too great to really go much beyond a buzz back then, it was good. Also, alcohol also silenced those critics. So on this brisk spring day in April, I had seen my brother-in-law laugh. It was an event that I could not have believed a few weeks before. He seemed happy. He appeared relaxed. and this seemed genuine. I recognized that feeling of comfort in his eyes that alcohol brought to me. But he was sober now, and I wanted some of that. I wanted it. I really wanted it now. I also wanted to run, not face reality. I wanted anything artificial to make me feel better. But I was tired. I was disconnected. My world was dark, and I no longer wanted to fight. It was not the first time that I had felt this desire to give up, but it was the first time that I also felt hope. If Jeff looked this way, then maybe I might be able to feel that way myself. But back in high school, there were beer bongs, 2-liter bottles of wine cooler, and keg parties. One might expect too much drink on a Saturday night when combined with a first cigarette, resulting in losing dinner on my father's feet, would leave me wary and wanting to avoid a repeat. But somehow the memory of that night vanished rapidly. If your relationship with alcohol is like mine, you will understand the call of comfort of opening a bottle. The gas that's released expresses a sigh and ease and comfort on its way. So sitting there in the parking lot, I scanned the vehicles around me. I always felt better on the road. Whether it was facing the rear of my parents' woody wagon, staring at the tailgating truck's grill from the back, or from the driver's bucket seat, and bending a path onto a highway and an escape from today. The isolation and solitude of the road were always warming. With constant movement, I was in control. I felt protected. Cement, metal, and glass walls existed between me and the others, but my life had become a roundabout. I had stopped drinking many times before, sometimes with a declaration that I'm done for now. Sometimes I would dangle a reward out there. No more beer till Friday. An excellent stopper I had become, but an expert restarter I had found myself to be. So what I had seen on that Saturday afternoon was a mirror. In Jeff, I had seen what I had always wanted to feel. I also saw the shadows that lurked in him and that I shared. At that moment in the parking lot of the treatment center, I recognized my lack of control. I finally saw that the fear that drove my mind's obsessions to replay and predict. For the first time, I had clarity. I understood the journey that I was about to begin. Now, some in recovery from alcoholism say that they are on a broad highway, no longer an escape path. We gaze forward on this highway to view where we are going. Each destination, however tricky or terrific, brings us comfort. On this road, we feel connected. We feel part of something bigger. And for many of us, we finally know peace. So right there, I conceded out loud to my steering wheel that I was an alcoholic. I had found the exit from the roundabout. And I had discovered the broad highway. Now I get to introduce the intermission.
A 5-minute intermission, so.
I'm so excited. I'm really short. That helps. Yeah, that's because I was thinking the same thing. Yeah. Another
It was so helpful. So it was reminded all this stuff. And she did that too. She was like, oh, you really this. I'm so proud of you. And then she'd be like, wait, this. And she was continuing to haunt me for the rest of my life. Oh my gosh, I wish I knew grammar by now. I actually like was some of the worst presentations of Chicago. And I was like, you and Jamie would get along really well. Totally, or even just like, yeah, and I actually worked out well. And she collects these, so she has like some like the stars with her and like named samples. Dude, I think oh, it's so interesting. It's really interesting. She's the secretary. Let's do it. Although it's probably really funny. Why would we? Yeah, I think I've seen him in Eric's story. Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah. That's great right now. Yeah. But yeah, he's always to that. He's a lot shorter. And I feel like everybody tells me that the name is now. But just so you know. I'm proud of her. I did, you know, like history. Yeah, I'm excited. I should probably start to unpick a little bit. Oh gosh. I think I was like mixed. But when I was younger, I was really. Yeah. I guess. Oh my god, it's so beautiful. Oh, I can't wait to get it. There's like a I guess we have similar mannerisms. I think that's what everyone is. Yes, yeah, very similar, but I have, my dad's very Chinese, so I have a lot of like coloring, yeah. It's Chinese. So I think I look like a mess, but when you meet my mom tomorrow, maybe you'll agree with me. It's Chinese. It's like the shorters. I mean, cool. I'll try and like go home in the day. Just try to like calm my way down. That's the thing. That was kind of the reason I wanted to. Smile and be like a crazy person. So if we're gonna get distracted, why is but I was like Scott, I was like grab myself. It was like cool. I was like, no, that's like a smile. It's very interesting. It's yours. I love it. I mean, I think it's not that. You, the listeners. It is that simple. I think also as the science writers, we're gonna do like this. I'll just like, yeah. When I hear like something yeah, like sort of like not personal. I caught that and figured it's so nervous. Oh god. My god, that's so funny. I'll send a picture. But there's also links. Yeah, they should have. well, we did say I'm going. Well, it feels good. She will. Yeah, I'm just so I was trying to wave to him. I know, my dad didn't realize like that. That's one person who can see. Nobody has to be like, I can't get over it. Yeah, I didn't get it. I think it's been nice. And I said, Frankie, I didn't know any of that. So I thought about it, but I was like, nah. He's just really tired. Yeah. Oh, it's just, he has a hard time. That's just a personal connection. I just want to like. Oh my gosh, it's so funny. Do whatever feels natural. Whatever feels natural. Whatever feels natural. Yeah. Wow. She thinks like stress tomorrow. Yeah. I will. And good job, by the way. Oh, thanks, Jack. I totally screwed up on her. No, you did great. It's not legally that hard.
We're going to get started again. I just wanted to tell everybody out there on Zoom to please stick around all the way to the end, because after the reading, Melissa will announce the winner of this year's faculty award. You will stick around here. Our next reader will be Liz Mirabelli Knight.
I'm going to be reading from a piece called 14,000 Specimens and Counting. There's a mountain lion in the freezer, and for good reason. Plunging below zero, the freezer kills carpet moths, and the mountain lion is riddled with moths. Luckily, quarantining in the cold does the trick, as Marty Christensen discovered. When it comes to keeping would-be scavengers off your taxidermy, sometimes you have to get a little creative. As sole manager of the Natural History Collection at the Ecotarium, a Worcester, Massachusetts Museum and Science Center, Christensen defends thousands of preserved animals, creatures that once prowled, perched, grazed, swam, flitted, and preened in this world, from natural forces of decay. It's all about getting to an equilibrium and maintaining it, he says. While the moth-ridden mountain lion will live to post primitively another day, not all battles are won. Years ago, the Ecotarium's entomology collection was depleted when pests got the upper hand. Christensen likes to joke that the preserved arachnids of Worcester County were eaten by their counterparts, living arachnids of Worcester County. Christensen's interest in natural history began in childhood, but it wasn't until a few years ago that he stepped away from a career in database management to follow a path in museum studies.
With equanimity, he accepts the fact that pests will persist in their determination to feast on his charges. Their nature. Besides, another aspect of the work consumes him. The ecotarium houses roughly 55,000 objects, animal, plant, mineral, and anthropological, in its natural history collection. Christensen, still something of a data lover, aims to catalog them all. Cataloging, the process of identifying items, accounting for their origins, and noting their present whereabouts, is the difference, he says, between a room full of really cool stuff and a museum. With only 14,000 specimens in the ecotarium's collection catalog so far, Christensen is about a quarter of the way done. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's the point of saving a bunch of dead critters, let alone going through the seemingly tedious process of naming and sorting them? Most objects in museum collections, even those at much larger institutions, never end up on display for the public anyway. While this is true, it doesn't mean that unseen items have no value. Around the world, natural history collections, amassed, stashed, and stored away cabinets of curiosity, archive the planet's biodiversity. Like a library of unread books, the ecotarium's collection has potential to inform future research. As our global climate rapidly changes, important scientific advances may rely on how well we can preserve the past. For a relatively small museum in central Massachusetts, the ecotarium has a sprawling collection because its history is long. Founded as the Worcester Lyceum of Natural History, it hit the scene in 1825, decades before a wave of similar societies swept the nation. According to historian Mark Barrow, the climate of post-Civil War America incubated scientific societies. He estimates that 4 times as many of these societies were established in the 40 years after the Civil War than the 40 years prior, and most new societies at the time included natural history collections. What fueled this 19th century fascination? By this time, Barrow writes, romanticism, an artistic and literary movement that placed spiritual value on nature, trickled into mainstream culture where it met a growing middle class with newly acquired luxuries like time and resources. Enamored with the outdoors, people brought it indoors. Career naturalists and hobbyists crowded their Victorian parlors with wildlife imagery and natural objects that later became the foundations of many museum collections. At the ecotarium, specimens once prized by local naturalists can be found under Christensen's care inside a large, shadowy, windowless room known as the collection storage room. Before stepping inside, guests sign a clipboard by the door and note the time. The museum limits visits to 15 minutes because of concerns over exposure to formaldehyde. For first-time visitors, 15 minutes is just long enough for the collection to shock and awe before the faint smell of age and poison reminds you that you are essentially inside a tomb. 57 towering open shelf cabinets dominate the space. They line the rectangular room in 2 rows and slide along metal tracks that secure them to the floor. When the cabinets are pushed close together, the contents of the shelves aren't visible. But pull one cabinet from its neighbor, and suddenly it's as if you flip the page in an I Spy book of picture riddles. Visual overload. One pull brings you face to face with more than 50 birds. North American forest species like barred owls and grosbeaks perch on wooden pedestals. They posture and puff, frozen forever in displays of aggression or attraction. Pull another pair of cabinets apart and seabirds stare down their beaks at you. There are albatross, auk, penguin, and puffin. Another cabinet houses the bones of whales and sawfish skulls. In another, there are piles of pelts wrapped in plastic. There are minerals, corals, and mollusk shells, as well as bats, moles, and mastodon teeth. In one cabinet, a snarling leopard rounds the corner. A he-hen cranes its head in another. A species in the grouse family, these birds once lived in Massachusetts, but have been extinct for almost 100 years. This one was collected in 1896. And that is where I will end, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Mel Cole.
Excellent, that was so awesome. I wrote this essay in the science narratives workshops class, and at some point we started calling ourselves the Science Narrative Sisterhood. So I just wanted to dedicate this essay to sisterhood. The signs were sprinkled here and there, proclaiming no trespassing, but also recreation area. Affixed to a tree was a crossed out stick figure on a white background. No people. I felt the excitement of a truant as I pushed through to a little clearing at the edge of the pond where the shore wasn't too steep. I was alone. I ducked into the murky shallows and was startled by the warmth. Like syrup, the water adhered to my skin. I emerged quickly, gasping, and covered in duckweed like a swamp thing. I thought I wouldn't go back. But as the summer heat forced the heady scented clethra into bloom, I became a regular at the clearing by the pond. I could have found a clear, cold lake. But I learned to enjoy being brushed by the tongues of water lilies, startled by snapping turtles, nibbled by curious fish. I let myself become some furry mammal in a tiny aquatic wilderness, like the beaver I had once seen at dusk. Cautiously, I began to explore the little woodland. The trees there grew unfettered and thick, and the forest floor opened out into an empty expanse of oak leaves and pine needles. Some paths were carved through the trees, but they led nowhere in particular. The lot, I knew, was only a few acres, but I felt like I could get lost there. I could wander in any direction, thinking I knew the way, and confront a fallen log, steep slope, or tumbled rock wall covered with forbidding poison ivy. In time, I felt increased comfort, less like an intruder. I wondered whether the woods might be used to me as well. I found a patch of blueberries inexplicably ungobbled by birds or deer. Once I found the strange and startling lobe of a lady slipper orchid, pink like a dressy purse forgotten in the leaf litter. In late summer, I found the pale, unearthly forms of ghost pipes feeding on the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. I thought of the fungi pervading the forest floor, connecting the trees root to root like some subterranean internet. If I tried, could I feel the thrum of it beneath my feet? The mycorrhizal fungi in the forest ecosystem can conduct electrical impulses in a mechanism similar to our own nerves and brains, like our own neural network. One day, it came upon me like a waking dream. I could see beneath the earth in my mind's eye, the synapses firing like sparklers. Did these trees know me? Did they talk about me? With every flamboyant mushroom, huge and perfect, that I stumbled upon, I felt more paranoid. Like an excited child, the woodland showed me things it had made while I wasn't looking. At times, I felt the unease of being haunted, like I was seeing something I couldn't explain. I knew, understood, that every tree, plant, and fungus was part of a greater complex being. But I had never sensed it so deeply. I could question all the enchantment once I left the woods. Could a little patch of trees know my carbonic breath, my bloody heat, the vibrations of my voice? It seemed conceited to think so. Once I lay against the sun-heated bark of a tree and felt my eyes turn hazy. I felt time pass, I thought, the way the tree must feel it, in slow motion. To the trees, I was a fly flitting about infrequently and living only a short, frantic life. Why try to understand such a creature? Big machines pulled into the empty lot where the house once stood. I knew what was coming. Even before the trucks, there were the blue and pink ribbons tied to trees like some macabre party game. I knew about the plans to build a park with places for swimming and fishing and picnic tables. Now a chain link fence stands between me and where I used to trespass. The whir of saws, crunching branches and grinding wood chips drown out any rustling leaves or bird song. The gentle smell of damp leaves and moist earth is overwhelmed by the sharp sun-heated pine chips. A tumbled stump reveals the white threads of the mycorrhizal fungi. My fantasies of their electric light are dulled in the sun. I don't know what I'm mourning for. I will go home to my wooden house, sit on a wooden chair on my wooden floor, write on a piece of note paper, and forget. But I'm already lonely for my strange friend. I know I must be mourning myself, my own fantasy of belonging. The woodland was never really a wilderness, only a neglected house lot where I had no right to be. But there I could dive into the pond weeds and feel some dormant and untamed part of myself. Whatever displacement I felt in my tiny wild life was absorbed into this strange neglected place. We'll meet again when all this is over, me in the woods, but we'll both be changed. We can start again from the beginning. And now I would like to introduce my classmate, Crystal Nguyen Wizdala. Thank you.
I'm going to be reading an excerpt from a piece called Love, Wolves, and Huge Bones. It was mid-November in Houghton, Michigan, and they already had 2 feet of snow on the ground with more falling. I had driven past the Petersons' burnt yellow, compact 2-story home twice before pulling into the driveway. It didn't feel like the home of a world-renowned conservation researcher working on the longest ongoing predator-prey study ever. The study of wolves and moose on Isle Royal. Carolyn Peterson, a 70-something-year-old woman with a thin frame, soft blue eyes, a ruby red jacket, and a floral apron with candy stitched onto it, greeted me at the door. "You've got fresh snow on your feet. It's fine," she says, noticing my hesitation to step onto their plush white carpet. The scent of simmering sweet apples warmed the house. Candy's sister, affectionately referred to as Dee Dee, sat in the Americana kitchen by a tarp-covered window, peeling Haralson apples from their hometown of Duluth. Rolf shuffled around in moccasins, suiting up to depart for the bone-filled warehouse in Alberta, a 40-minute drive from the house. He's draped in brown, a brown wolf embroidered cap, a brown sorrel coat, brown pants, brown socks, brown boots. "When you get there, tell me what you think looks like a fire hazard," Candy calls out from the kitchen as I slip on the pink wool socks and mucker boots she insisted I use. "Say hi to the bones for me," she adds. On the way, we stopped at the bone staging area, Gene Hesterberg Hall at the School of Forestry for Michigan Tech. Inside Wolf's 2 unassuming boxes or rooms were boxes of bones, tubs of bleach, and faded index cards from 1958. Wolf points to the pathology line on one of the handwritten cards, his wintry eyes squinting from behind his reading glasses. "They didn't leave nearly enough space for arthritis back then," Rolf says in his soft yet authoritative voice. He's been on the project since nearly its beginning. Since then, researchers honed in on arthritis as a major malady of the aging Isle Royale moose. The island's wolf population had dwindled to only 2 wolves in 2018, leaving the 1,500 moose unchecked and free to chew through an unsustainable amount of vegetation. Wolves on the island are often afflicted with disease and malformations from inbreeding, such as asymmetrical spines. As a result of climate change, natural ice bridges between the island and Ontario, Canada haven't solidified regularly, segregating the robust mainland wolves from the islanders, leaving the latter population to suffer. The goal of this more than 60-year-old research project is to bring back wolves to Isle Royal to bring balance to the ecosystem. We pulled into the Ford Center complex in Alberta, which was once used for processing timber to adorn classic cars. Wolf parked his snow tire-equipped Prius outside an inconspicuous metal shed, where Mary Hindelang, a petite retired wildlife ecologist with a moose embroidered hat, joined us inside along with her husband and black Labrador. 20,000 bones. Rolf led us through narrow alleys of shelves piled high with metatarsals, mandibles, spines, fibulas, tibias, and skulls. We navigated toward a door into the back into another area, passing moose legs taller than me. A sign hung on the sheet metal wall. "Please touch, but be gentle." "Here's the pathology bones," Rolf says, pointing at a line of boxes. He pulls a few from the shelves and begins rummaging for examples of arthritic and osteoporosis afflicted bones to share. I see the fire hazards. Cardboard boxes once used to hold apples, Cocoa Puffs, or muck boots were piled in front of the back door, now full of bones. Electric cords dangled from the ceiling. A brave little fire extinguisher peeked out from behind the boxes. We bring 3 boxes back with us and I get cozy with one in the back seat. The bones tell a story. The lines show their age, the hips and spine show cartilage degeneration. The shape of the bones divulges the stress the moose has suffered from genetics, development, the environment, or a combination of the above. Did the bones speak to you? Candy asks me as we re-enter the warmth of the Peterson home. I can't hear them, but some people can. And that is it for my piece, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Blake Boyer.
Hello, I'll be reading from my piece, Scientists Use Manure Processing Tech to Make Whiskey More Sustainable. If you've ever been to a dairy farm, you know exactly what it smells like. On average, a dairy cow produces 82 pounds of poop every day. For their cows, there's a whole lot of poop. This malodorous phenomenon sparked the curiosity of Pat Heist and Shane Baker, who had a national dairy farm with 38,000 cattle in the unavoidable fields of dung. In his thick Eastern Kentucky accent, Heist says he remembers asking the dairy farmer, "What do you do with all this cow crap?" It was not lost on Heist that 38,000 cows would produce unimaginable amounts of manure, more than 3 million pounds every day. The farmer, who wanted to remain anonymous, offered a surprising explanation that sparked an idea for Heist, microbiologist, and Baker, an engineer. The pair of scientists co-owned the distillery, Wilderness Trail, and when they learned about the dairy farm solution, they realized they could make the future of whiskey production more sustainable. The farmer showed them a system of large pipes and metal tanks that takes in mushy cow feces and spits out 2 streams, dry manure in one and mostly clear water in the other. Using high-pressure columns, the device presses manure against stainless steel filters with microscopic pores squeezing out water. The result, a concentrated manure product that can be shipped to farms as fertilizer in fewer and lighter truckloads. The technology isn't new or unique. It's called ultrafiltration. When showing off the device, the farmer urged Heist to taste the filtered water. Heist says he politely declined, but it looked pretty damn clear, he adds with a laugh. And that got Heist and Baker thinking. After we saw the technology, we were like, aha, Baker says, because the same technique might be applied to stillage, the waste from grain alcohol production that is sloppy and waterlogged, just like manure, and typically gets transported to farms to feed livestock. Getting rid of stillage has always been a problem for companies that ferment grains, whether fuel alcohol plants, breweries, or distilleries. To make a single barrel, about 53 gallons, of 100 proof alcohol like whiskey, it takes about 6,000 pounds of grain and water, most of which becomes waste. Hence, distilleries that make thousands of gallons of alcohol a day produce tons of grain waste. It quickly piles up, sometimes faster than they can eliminate, forcing distillers to close their operation until they can catch up. Distillers have to process their stillage before they can get rid of it, which has a significant energy cost. Most rely on farmers who use the processed grain as livestock feed to haul it away in semi-trucks, and that's expensive because they must pay farmers to take it. Farmers charge distilleries for time and transportation costs, and some even demand a premium to take the sloppy grains. Many whiskey producers spend millions of dollars a year dealing with their stillage. The waste process is inefficient, leading to increased fossil fuel use, amplifying their carbon footprint. Yet the way distilleries manage their waste has remained mostly the same for decades. After seeing the ultrafiltration technology used for manure, Heist and Baker adapted it to process the leftover whiskey grains at their distillery in Danville, Kentucky. Every day, Wilderness Trail produces 100,000 gallons of stillage, but since installing ultrafiltration, they've been slashing that in half. The new approach uses less land and less energy than the traditional methods. It consolidates 100,000 gallons of stillage down to 50,000 gallons of concentrated wet grains, while squeezing out 50,000 gallons of reusable, recyclable water. As natives of the Bluegrass State, where liquor production accounts for an $8.94 billion annual share, nearly 4% of the economy, Heist and Baker claim the potential savings could have a huge economic impact. This might be the holy grail for Kentucky bourbon, Heist says. Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce our next reader, my classmate Chelsea Nowak.
Thank you. This is an excerpt from the last page of my piece, Calm and Still, which explores yoga's therapeutic benefits on Parkinson's disease. Both yoga and meditation use a tool so sublime in its simplicity, yet powerful in its effect, the breath. Experts believe that when breath is short and quick, the brain receives signals at a faster rate. Those signals tell the brain to activate the sympathetic nervous system, which produces stress hormones, muscle tension, and anxiety. In contrast, a slow, deep breath will activate the parasympathetic response, which increases feelings of relaxation and focus. Among the physiological benefits of yoga, Marie Van Poembroek stressed the psychological component as well. Across the board, the therapy group felt so good being around others with Parkinson's. It ended up being a great resource sharing opportunity, she said. Such resources included support groups, doctors, and even treatments. They saw people out there living with Parkinson's fearlessly. Almost all talked about how they had felt withdrawn from their community, but by the end of the study, they felt more engaged, Van Poembroek said. A cohort to enjoy yoga practice with and who also understands explicitly what each person is going through can feel comforting. However, Keith Erickson had a different experience. When he taught a yoga class for Parkinson's patients at Stanford University, he found it disquieting. It was depressing. I felt sad. I saw people who were further along than me, and it was, well, you get it. His raw honesty caused me to reflect deeply on the subject as I left his regular class. Even by following the Book of Health line by line, our body's faculties can break down. Our synapses may shatter without warning, while our chromosomes wink like mischievous sirens, aware of our genetically predestined future. Some of us must persevere through nature's cruelest punishments. Rivers of green tea and mountains of health supplements cannot outweigh the largest adversary of them all, our biology. But then again, if we make peace with our largest adversary, perhaps we do not need to go into battle at all. As I learned that warm autumn morning in his yoga class, Erickson made peace with his body through yoga, and in turn, he had connected his body back to his mind, creating a truce in the Parkinson's battlefield. Yoga may not cure Parkinson's disease, but for people such as Erickson and those in Van Poembroek's study, it made the journey between the mind and the body calm and still. I'm pleased to introduce our next reader, my classmate, Megan Reckman.
The last. I will be reading a piece called The Homemade Bathing Suit. You're right. Really bad at packing for vacation, like really bad. One time, I went to Lake Placid in January and I forgot to pack a coat. If I might remind you, Lake Placid is where they held 2 Winter Olympic Games. Needless to say, it's freezing and coats are essential. I managed to survive. On another trip, my honeymoon to be exact, my husband and I took the Highlands of Scotland. We stayed in castles, we stayed in cottages, we stayed with a lot of sheep. But as soon as we went to unpack on our first night, I realized I had forgotten shoes. Again, I managed to survive thanks to the Birkenstocks I wore on an airplane across the Atlantic. I have all the requirements of a lousy packer: procrastination, absent-mindedness, false optimism, and too much of a focus on the big ideas and not as much focus on the small details like shoes. But nothing compares to the time that I tried to get ahead of myself and for once be prepared for vacation. I had decided enough was enough and I would have proper attire as I solo traveled to Key West, the southernmost city in the United States. So a few days before I left, I made myself a homemade bathing suit. Here's how it happened. I found an old bathing suit in the back of my closet. It was one of the good ones. One that covers the bum, enhances the bust, one that tucks in the chunks and carves out the curves. It fit like snakeskin, but was also good if you had to run to the bathroom, had a little room for that. It was a perfect suit, except for one thing. It was old. Do you guys know how old bathing suits get weird? They begin to disintegrate and pill and just fade away. This bathing suit was plagued with disintegration. It was pilling in the most unappealing places, and the dark black stretch fabric had turned a pigeon gray. It was disheartening, to say the least. There is nothing more horrifying than shopping for a new bathing suit, if you know what I mean. But then an idea was born. I would take that swimsuit, strip it of its aged exterior, and sew on a new bright and swim-worthy cover over the trusty old lining. To the needle and thread, I snipped and clipped and threaded and stitched until the bathing suit was back. I posed in the mirror,
I put on my green sun hat. I envisioned myself eating ripe pineapple on a light drenched beach, and I was ready for Florida. Key West is located at the far end of a swarm of bridge-linked islands 3 hours south of Miami. It's closer to Cuba than the rest of Florida's panhandle. As with so much of the United States history, Native peoples populated these lands until they were forced from their culture and evacuated from their homes. In Key West, this happened to be the Tequesta Tribe, known for their ability to survive solely off food from the sea: turtles and conch, clams and oysters, trunkfish and sharks, stingrays, and even manatees. I was impressed to learn about the Tequesta Tribe and their perseverance against large hurricanes, and something even more impressive: mosquito season. They would pick up their entire villages and relocate further inland during the 3-month blood-sucking fest to avoid mosquitoes. And all I can say is I've never agreed more with people I've never met. The Florida Keys have more than history. They're also geologically interesting. Portions of the Keys that appear to be solid land are actually visible coral reefs. After the last ice age, glacial activity drowned most of Florida, and the coral was born underwater. Over time, as the sea grew and shrunk, the coral was exposed and began to erode and change. And while the world warmed and cooled, the other small geological and biological wonders eroded and changed too. Landing on the coral, oolites, or egg-shaped sedimentary stones, created gravel stacks that built up the base of the Keys. Microscopic moss animals known as bryozoa began to die off as sea level shifted, and their mineralized skeletons layered upon the coral like trifle. Finally, sand stripped from limestone topped off the whole shebang, and there you have the Florida Keys. I couldn't wait to get there. I drove US Highway 1 as fast as I dared. The endless horizon hypnotized me with the Gulf of Mexico on my right and the Atlantic to the left. Instead of the squirrels I was used to in New York diving into traffic, I was greeted with kamikaze iguanas. Lightning fast, they darted towards my tires. After 3 hours, I reached the beach. The limestone sand beckoned and the sea called to my swollen feet. Behind my car door, I made a quick change into my homemade bathing suit, checked in the side view mirror and said, looking good. 1, 2 steps, 3, and the water splash. It was as though the earth had drawn me a warm bath. Salty and gritty, I let the water run over my lips. What a joy. I was buoyant in a moment, floating, carefree. But as you should have guessed, it was short-lived. As I said, I'm really bad at packing for vacation, and the homemade bathing suit lived up to my previous plights. Just 30 minutes in the salty sea disintegrated the stitches I had placed, and the fabric grew transparent. My entire bathing suit was see-through, and I was as exposed as the coral I stood on. I sunk beneath the surface of the water, hoping I didn't have an audience. A quick look left, a check to the right, no one had noticed yet. I swam out a bit farther to ensure my embarrassment remained my own. As the sunbathers shrank from my view, I decided to stay out in the water for the remainder of the day, waiting for dusk to make my escape. Hours later, sunburnt and shameless, I snuck off the bank between the palm trees. As the beachgoers packed up their coolers and towels, and I made a run for my car, scrambling to safety in the front seat. I must admit, nothing made me miss lacking shoes in Scotland more than standing near naked in a homemade bathing suit on Key West's southern shore. Thank you.
As we said, stick around for a minute. For 2 more things. But first of all, I would like to pause to give one more round of applause for our marvelous readers. You were all and such talent for tonight. I'm really overjoyed. We do us proud with this glorious resumption of our in-person thesis readings. Thank you all. And now it is my honor to present the Excellence in Teaching Award for this year. The faculty member who is receiving this year's teaching award is part of the bedrock of this graduate program. A decade ago, back when our courses were held in classrooms like this, program leaders asked this faculty member if she would teach a workshop in science and medical writing. The catch, this workshop would not take place in a physical classroom, but online. Sure, she said, with a little trepidation, but she agreed. And the course was an enormous success. And then came others, a host of other courses, in fact, including the ever popular nature writing course and the wonderful residency in Bar Harbor, Maine. And with every single course, this faculty member contributed her incredible talents as a teacher, guide, mentor, and editor. This faculty member has an acute ability to suss out what students are trying to achieve in a first draft, and the rare talent for helping students see the strengths and weaknesses in their work without bruising or inflating their egos. I could go on, but I will wrap up by sharing a short comment that a student made in describing what she most valued about a class with this instructor. The student simply said, "She challenges us to think beyond the obvious." She challenges us to think beyond the obvious, which to me really sums up the aim of our courses and perhaps of science writers overall. And with this, if you haven't guessed by now, I am delighted to present this year's Excellence in Teaching Award to Sue Eisenfeld. Who's not here in person, but I think she's out there in Zoom land, so congratulations, Sue. Much deserved award. And I do have one last thing I'd like to mention, or present, not an award, but Sam, if you could join me up here for a moment. As Sam mentioned, today it's the first day we actually met in person for the first time. Sam joined us just as COVID, or just before COVID needed its presence felt, and so we weren't able to meet in person, but we did have our weekly meetings, Sam and I, on Zoom. And I did happen to notice, Sam, that you are fond of ball caps. So I present to you your very own.
Thank you very much. Is that I got this job during the pandemic and couldn't get a haircut, and it got more and more out of control, and eventually I was showing up to meetings with faculty and administration, people with a hat on. It got embarrassing for everybody. Thank you very much.
And now you're official.
Many congratulations here on the Zoom chat as well for everybody to pursue. Congrats again.
That's our evening. Thank you, everybody, for traveling here from Michigan, California, and New York, and more. These things